John Wilkinson was born in London and grew up in Cornish coast and on Dartmoor. After university at Cambridge, he trained as a psychiatric nurse and worked in mental health services and public health in the West Midlands, South Wales, and London's East End. In 2005, he moved to the United States and has held academic positions in the University of Notre Dame and the University of Chicago. Apart from this, however, he is a brilliant poet, of profound intellect and luminous erudition, as I believe that he has just proven now. And I can't disagree with him more. I think that he is the perfect person to open a festival such as this one. His works include My Reef, My Manifest Array, which I recently purchased with my own money and fell into deep joy while reading in airports and Seattle cafes. As well as Ghost Nets, Schedule of Unrest, Selected Poems, Reckitt's Blue, and he has also published essay collections like The Following and A Lyric in Its Time. John was also the man who brought me into the fold of the University of Chicago, and it's my sincere pleasure right now to engage in conversation with you. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Well, it's terrific to be back in Delhi. It's the second time that I've visited. And it's great to be opening this event. I'd like to start by thanking Lena. I'm beginning to think that the greatest achievement of my career at the University of Chicago was Lena's appointment. And also Avik. It's, I know, been quite an extraordinarily complex task of organization, which has been carried out with amazing grace and ability by Lena and Avik. Now, listening to the introductions, it occurred to me that it is somewhat eccentric to be starting a conference which is principally around multilingual poetry by inviting an elderly British modernist monolingual poet to speak. For that is what I am. But on the other hand, it might at least give us some sense of the history that we will be leaving behind as I am superseded by the dazzling speakers later in this conference. So I will deliver this lecture, which is in defense of stress. And it might seem odd for a poet working in an essential syllabic language like English to feel any need to recommend the virtues of stress, or indeed for anybody to recommend the virtues of stress in Delhi. Stress has, however, been itself under stress for some time in poetic practice in the US and the UK. Lyric stress patterns have become suspect, either associated with the lyric tradition's implied claim to universality, or on the contrary, deemed to claim spuriously the independence of the individual from the determinants and creativity of language itself. There's merit in both objections, and I'd add one further, that some poetry aims to seduce with comforting stress. We don't experience the familiar stresses of a sleeping partner's breath as disturbing, for instance, unless they snore. Poetry evoking the familiar stresses of regular breathing tends to serve a functionalist view of art as essentially reparative. Like a lullaby, it knits up the ravelled sleeve of Claire. So there's a kind of stress that isn't really stressful, offering aesthetic experience as a balm, which opens up the question of when stress becomes rhythm, when rhythm becomes stressful, and if rhythm needs to be stressful to provoke attention. If we set aside reparative rhythmic patterns, disdain lyric stress as individualistic, and condemn lyric stress organized around the first-person singular for claiming to transcend history, culture, gender, race, and all other variables, as readers we may not feel much invested in what's left, even if adept at conceptual accounts of what a flat text is about. One reason is that suppressing stress breaks poetry's link with orality, with the body, and with human sociality. This also goes for prose when it becomes jargon, uninflected language vacated of individual feeling and active thinking. Objection to stress is not confined to poetry. It pervades Western liberal culture. A telling example is the replacement of argument or debate with the word conversation. This isn't making a reactionary point about so-called snowflakes. After all, while the term microaggression has been taken to imply sensitivity to insignificant, if not imagined, slights, its most eloquent advocate, Claudia Rankine, situated on the lower rungs of an escalator up to the violent stress to the extreme of lynching and police murder visited on black Americans individually and collectively. Rather, I'm thinking of a wellness ideology and industry committed to reducing individuals' exposure to stress, as well as to short-circuit their physical and psychological stress responses. True self-scrutiny is substituted by scrutiny of the dinner plate, managing food intolerances. Stress aversion of this kind is not simply apolitical, but fundamentally anti-political, exemplified in the right-wing individualism of some Silicon Valley tech magnates. A debased version of Buddhism espoused in such wellness ideology disdains Buddhism's central ethical charge of compassion for all creatures, which doesn't mean feeding your pooch on caviar. What then might be the virtues of stress? No question, stress can be debilitating or even deadly. Who would invite or welcome the stress experienced by the residents of Kyiv or those enduring the London wartime blitz? Whatever the secondary gain, excuse me, could I have some water? So some water, all right? For we do have testimonies from both times and places of a fuller experience of social being, in Britain having its political after effect in a post-war welfare state. But I think we'd agree, thank you, that a condition of continuous stress or an experience of violent extreme stress are to be avoided. The question is how to convert stress into a force for life rather than despondency, sickness, or impotent rage, into life that transports or that struggles or that creates a refuge in solidarity, community, or faith. Consider the notorious stress of a person in a high-pressure urban environment like New York, or Delhi indeed, and the varying responses to it, not determined exclusively by relative affluence. The adaptation process relies on the dialectic at work between the stress of individual subjectivity in relation to social, economic, and linguistic determinants, and the stress of social engagement and legibility in the face of legitimate individual needs and demands. That dialectic can motivate art with transhistorical and transcultural impact, universal, if you like. I'll end this talk with an example in the poetry of Gwendolyn Brooks. First, though, I want to say something about trained sensitivity to stress, because the poetry I'm engaged with as a writer and a reader requires training in close reading to recognize and negotiate its stresses. A decline in such training, which I received at high school, is contemporary with the blunting or avoidance of stress. And in the British and American academies, close reading has largely retreated to creative writing workshops, even if the workshop is in danger of becoming a stress-averse environment. What interests me is a flattening or digitalizing of experience, a de-stressing scarcely affected by nostalgia for vinyl or silver halide film. Decline in the academic study of English literature occasions much self-interested hand-wringing in departments of English. It has been ascribed to harsh competitive conditions for employment, preferring vocational courses, the deplorable materialism of the younger generation, the admirable progressive activism of the younger generation, the distracting effects of social media, the rise of alternative creative media, such as video games, the collapse of a literary canon reflecting white heterosexual male dominance, and malign politicians. The apogee of academic instruction in close reading and literary history was attained at a brief moment in the 1950s and 1960s, remaining essential to a reaction in subsequent deconstructive theory. Reliance on such a literary culture and its associated skills has become anachronistic. In Britain, most students find readable only poems reflecting their immediate interests. And I've heard a creative writing student in Chicago say he doesn't see why he should be interested in old poems, that is, that haven't recently won major prizes, so showing him the way. Not that all immediate interests are damaging. Poetry serving a constituency can greatly exceed as well as fulfill its overt intent. As the corpus of 17th century Christian English poetry demonstrates, so does a magnificent corpus of black US poetry directed at a black politically active constituency from Gwendolyn Brooks and Amiri Baraka to the present. I have a handout. I should have done something with it. So take George Herbert's The Elixir, which as a child I was taught to sing as a hymn, my hymnal leaving out the second verse, presumably as too abstract. Teach me, my God and King, in all things thee to see, and what I do in anything to do it as for thee. Not rudely, as a beast, to run into an action, but still to make thee prepossessed and give it his perfection. A man that looks on glass, on it may stay his eye, or if he pleaseth, through it pass, and then the heaven espy. All may of thee partake, nothing can be so mean, which with his tincture for thy sake will not grow bright and clean. A servant with this clause makes drudgery divine, who sweeps a room as for thy laws, makes that and action fine. This is the famous stone that turneth all to gold, for that which God doth touch and own cannot for less be told. On the face of it, this is a poem of simple faith, but the verse about a man that looks on glass is telling in ways that exceed the proverbial and devout. Oscillation between surface and depth, between glass and prospect, might be taken to direct how to read the poem itself. That's how we read, if close readers. And what if the glass were a looking glass, and heaven therefore lies in the eyes that seek God? What are the transformations of the last two verses? The verse lines sweep to and fro according to prosodic laws, and this movement is the touch of the alchemical stone. But it has already happened, even before the tincture, which is another word for philosopher's stone. What turns to gold is not what is seen through glass. The glass itself is transmuted by the tincture of thee. Thee and thy, the very act of address to another, has this telling effect. The switch was made from me to thee in the first verse. No more me. We can all partake of this theeness, the theeness of communion. The poem features a cluster of th sounds to facilitate this. Mine is a tendentious reading, as though I were the thee and were prepossessed, and this poem also feels as though it arises from the loam of the language, familiar before we even think about it. A tension exists, though, between such recognition and the sophistication of the poem's metaphors, producing a certain awkwardness in its rhythm. This awkwardness snags me, making this hymn or poem persist in memory, where 100 hymns I sang quite as often have no lasting presence. For instance, the lines, which with his tincture for thy sake, and who sweeps a room as for thy laws, are sung according to regular meter in the hymn. I'm not going to sing it, I will spare you that. But the poem's gathering emphasis on thy introduces a counter-rhythm that brings the poem's stresses into a tension. Rhythm becomes stressful in a way that demands a reader's assent. Yes, I too am thine, or not. Isn't it convenient that my servant's drudgery can be made divine? Stress can be felt too between a series of statements, their metaphorical charge, and their prosody. That is, between doctrine and an individual's imaginative understanding and attachment to that doctrine. My hymnal's excision of a verse betrayed how awkwardly this poem fit a use presuming an orthodox expression of faith, unaffected by the stress an individual might feel negotiating such faith. Added to that, my discussion relies on close reading, and for a secular modern, that introduces the stress of abdicating from the scriptural context. In the eyes of the faithful, to close read this poem would itself constitute a form of resistance, like a secular art historian interpreting the imagery of a biblical scene by Caravaggio as queer. Loving Herbert's poem, I can't adore it as if it were an icon. Historically, literary close reading did not emerge out of nowhere, and all religious traditions have promoted exegesis of scriptures and major commentaries with forensic attentiveness to textual detail. There would have been scrupulous, trained exegetes among George Herbert's contemporaries, but the important distinction is that of motivation, The religious exegete is, at whatever remove, working to clarify the demands made on the faithful for right living and right dying. And of course, conspiracy theories like QAnon demand paranoid close reading in order to massage all texts into alignment with their systems of belief. Literary close reading begins in its purest form by bracketing out such motivation. The question to be asked then of the elixir is not what it says about right living, although that is the poem's evident focus, but how it performs. This can lead to the impression, with the text as clear in its overt message as Herbert's, that close reading invents difficulties where none exist, and that poems provide opportunities for critics to show off their ingenuity. In practice, close reading did come to privilege irony, ambiguity, and notably the so-called parsimonious text, where every element and aspect can be brought to serve a reading that leaves nothing unaccounted for. Faced with the surrealist or Baroque poem, it flounders helplessly. Training in close reading helped shape 20th century Anglo-American poetry, as well as how poems are read. It promoted close writing, to coin a phrase, poems rewarding special readerly skills, including the capacity to track and take pleasure in stress, as well as to be affected by subtle disruptions. And it encouraged poets to write intricately. Although the combined ingenuity, passion, complex stresses, and strenuous thought in the poetry of John Donne, its astonishing shuttle between the tightly wound and the intimately conversational has never been equalled in English. Close reading assumptions underpin not only conservative formalist poetry, but also confessional poetry, New York school poetry, Black Mountain poetry, apocalyptic poetry, even some language poetry. It's inconceivable to read, say, Susan Howe, if you're not skilled in close reading. At the same time, during the heyday of close reading, not only poems of greetings card sentimentality were despised as beneath notice, but also those of a writer as powerful as Allen Ginsberg or as popular as Charles Bukowski. They've had their revenge. Vernacular poetry influenced by the Beats and by a long history of black spoken word poetry is now the mainstream through hip-hop culture as well as in slam. There can seem to be two distinct universes of seminar poetry and street poetry, acutely felt in a university on the south side of Chicago. As the most theoretically sophisticated poetry has shied away from stress, in rap, the exploitation of traditional stress patterns complicated by offbeats is central and obvious. Where core messages are not in question, what's most valued are skills in managing stresses, linguistic inventiveness, and performance. Working with and off culturally embedded rhythmic patterns is a feature of more literary black poetry too, as is the amazing resurgence of sonnet writing, along with clashing high and low registers, like street vernaculars and underworld cant in Elizabethan and Renaissance drama. In poetic modes strongly connected to an identifiable community, individuality can be asserted through exchange, riding on shared rhythms, very directly in the bragging responses of hip-hop, rather than through introspection. But the isolated lyric poet was always a caricature, absurd given the intense friendships and enmities between the romantic poets of Germany and England. Exchange has been vital to close writing poetry too, with as a shining example the social lyric of Frank O'Hara emerging from New York gay artistic culture during the pre-Stonewall era when gays were persecuted. But the point about exchange can be made more generally around close acquaintance with poetic tradition. Politically, this cuts both ways. Attachment to tradition can be reactionary, but a language use doubling down on non-semantic properties of language, as exploited by generations of poets, can resist linguistic utility and challenge ideology encoded in normative usage. This has been a working assumption of radical writers in English from Shelley onwards. However, the reception assumption of such writing has relied on readers with a trained literary attention, in Shelley's time trained in Greek and Latin poetics. This readership may always have been small, but during the period of maximal prestige of close reading, coinciding with a huge expansion of university education in Britain and the United States, it did constitute a receptive constituency for close writing poets. Although at a time of political crisis, Shelley did turn to the popular ballad form with The Mask of Anarchy and planned an entire collection of popular ballads. We're seeing something similar now in the return of popular forms, and it was striking how some prominent language poets, explicitly averse to first-person syntax and rhythmic urgency, resorted to direct, personally committed language in the wake of the US invasion of Iraq. Conditions of stress felt in the body insist on stressed expression or wholesale avoidance of stress, if available by mindful or pharmacological means. What connection does attrition of close reading have with stress aversion? Considerable, despite the overt politics of much paratactical and flattened poetry. Close writing poetry came to squeamishly repudiate the first-person lyric because the subject position is a social construction with no legitimate authority, as though the subject position always implicitly made universal claims. But poetry evacuated at the first-person singular tends paradoxically towards an even stronger claim to authority, which I'll note later. Meanwhile, comforting poetry remains vastly popular, as in the writing of Rupi Kaur. Love will come, and when love comes, love will hold you, love will call your name, and you will melt. Sometimes, though, love will hurt you, but love will never mean to. Love will play no games, 'cause love knows life has been hard enough already. Okay, that's just a sort of random sample. It'd be crazy to try to close read this. It knows its readers, and in its stress-free way offers a stress reduction technique which must be effective for its readers. A more rigorous and far from comforting aversion to stress characterises the recent poetry of J.H. Prynne, routinely described as Britain's major late modernist poet, where eliminating cadence and stress results in a kind of circuit board writing, whose coherence relies on a philological underwebbing, invisible to most, and on knowledge of the prior corpus of Prynne's poetry. This imposes severe demands on the close reader. In fact, demands it would be impossible to meet, which may be part of the point. Agency has been offshored into the linguistic archive as a basis for textual production deemed autonomous, with Maoist dialectic its motor. When reciting his work, Prynne has asked his audience to shut their eyes, enter the darkness, and watch for twinkles of light, like certain practices of meditation. To abdicate from the stress of authorship and critical reception lies at a far remove from combative relationship with pre-existing texts, whether by middle period Prynne in poems such as The Oval Window or Not You, or M. Nubesi Philip Zong, or Layli Long Soldiers, Whereas, or my colleague Chiku Reddy's Voyager. A painful and productive relationship with mother tongue and or patriarchal authority, encoded in historical record, contract or treaty, asks for close reading by both writer and reader. It doesn't necessarily receive it. One pedagogical approach directs students to the poem's methodology and excerpts from source text before samples of the poems are read, so individual and collective violence and pain can be discussed abstractly, stress-free. Reading late Prynne can be a stressful experience. Attempts at close reading commit a category mistake. The truly stressful can be close kin to stress-free. Both approach absolute conditions. Neither can admit doubt or nuance. Faced, as you are, with samples of a text like aquatic hockets, and there's an inevitable arbitrariness in choosing from Prynne's recent output. In the last 3 or 4 years, he's published some 20-plus books, many of which are akin to the sample you have in front of you. My training means I can't resist in diving into close reading. Hockets, I discover, is French for hockey stick, maybe pointing to sportiveness in the life aquatic, but a hockey or hocket is also a shepherd's crook and might prime us to read a pastoral. An epigraph from John Dowland's second book of songs or airs to the book as a whole announces, though all my wares be trash, the heart is true, further hinting that what follows may not be quite serious, while the first poem's title, Welcome Handcart, might tell us as readers to go to hell, going to hell in a handcart being a proverbial phrase, or suggest the following poem is a vehicle piled with miscellaneous goods. So here's the first stanza. Foolish chalice, upset target, circumspect react, vapid, insipid, if wet marshes cahoots will brazen, dimmest business freight. Awning crews soonest, bruised up stirrup, fat trial. Lost or daft, boil crevice, divisible graphical. Get full on track, placate them all now. Point the stick, allocate stitchwork, sicken for bracken, broken off. Find devoid, ovoid liquid, each steeped at brunt clipper, dapper dibdabs matter. Chat, grated, ice trappist, burnish grab, likely, unfrankly, be infrequent, not tropic, distinct, elaborate, splint. Sicken for bracken, broken off, and dapper dibdabs matter sound like automatic writing, if under constraints, although the prosody is non-accentual and not syllabic. The linear constraints are cookie cutter. Ice trappist sounds like a silly and arbitrary pun on trapped in ice. There is a quality of fiat here, of ex cathedra statement. The readout does not permit psychological inquiry or nuance because there is no speaking position, and no cadence because cadence requires voice effect. In each of the book's 16 two-stanza poems, the most assertive punctuation mark is the semicolon, true for a preponderance of Prynne's recent writing. An online grammatical tutorial tells us, use a semicolon to join two related independent clauses in place of a comma and a coordinating conjunction, and but or not for so yet. Make sure when you use the semicolon that the connection between the two independent clauses is clear without the coordinating conjunction. That indicates a semicolon's utility in Prynne's poems, flaunting the mark of juxtaposition without specified connection. Words are no longer parts of speech, and organization is syntactical in a machine language sense rather than utterance-shaped. No word has priority, no word governs. Here is just how things are, heaped in a handcart. Why shape this output into stanzas, and why associate it through Dowland with song? The book's final poem ends with a clue. Enhances translexis, into want of front parade admit parakeet, flit up and subsequent waited hour-long, new song it will belong, in verity be true. Following an injunction to bake up your pies, this smacks of having your cake and eating it. A translexis, in other words, automatic writing, and a front parade, parade is a good description of these words in order, are enjoined to admit parakeet so as to elicit a new song. Since the call of a parakeet is much like a blade on a whetstone, this may be as serious as the final tautology, in verity be true, in other words, a put-on. There is no song in this book, and no basis for an ascription of truth. True to what? Yet strangely, song is of central importance to Prynne's poetics, inasmuch as folk song is conceived to arise prior to authorship or any individual performance. This in Elizabethan times, it should be pointed out that the title song is no indication of vocal performance. In Elizabethan times, it seems to be a non-committal word used similarly to lesson. Song then is independent of singing, although a parakeet might argue the point. We might rejoin that a parakeet song is heard as unstressed, even if a bird song can be modified by a change of environment. We certainly hear crows quarrel, or a parakeet expert might recognize stress in the sounds of a caged parakeet. But as readers of this poem, we fall back on pattern recognition, as we would in identifying a bird song. These are language twitters, as various as a nightingale's repertoire, if much less melodious. You can't argue with a nightingale. You can't enter mentally into an exchange with the nightingale. You'd be hard-pressed to sing along with a nightingale. Even the most learned ornithologist would have difficulty in interpreting what this particular nightingale means by this particular song passage. Any response is thwarted because a reader is deprived of guidance as to where priority or stress lies in the word array. Remarkably, these are verses in which line breaks introduce no suspense or emphasis, and I can't think of any other poetry in English where that's true. Yet an ornithology of poetry would identify, an ornithologist of poetry would identify these poems instantly as Prynne's. If you really wanted to eliminate all traces of a speaking voice, business school extrudes plenty of machine-like language, whereas the extreme idiosyncrasy of Prince poetry encourages its reception as tablets brought down from the mountain. Sometimes one gets the impression no one should cause stress to anyone or hear about others' stress because that would be too stressful, even in a creative writing workshop. Really, as people starve, as they die on rafts and crossing arid borders, as missiles reduce homes to rubble, we're now told that's disaster porn. But it's porn for you if everything around you has leveled out and your capacity for responsive stress has been drained by distraction. In a perfect world, spared even microaggressions, we might combine in limitless configurations and communities, encounter no resistance. In that perfect world, we'd be numb at the nerve endings and armoured in our skins. A Pretty Air by Dowland can make me tearful, and a poem by George Herbert take my breath away. They are organised around stresses and exercise stress that troubles my composure, the composure of a fallow subjectivity. Art offers no answer to horror, but if daily torment, including tedium, would fix us in stress positions, art gives us some limited space, some wiggle room, to react with the active, shifting stresses of our artwork and of our close reading, our restless interpretation of what is evoked in us an aesthetic experience, because we should want to know by what means this came about, especially when, from a religious or political matrix, we might despise and need to resist. We might need to resist our love, even. The subjectivity of aesthetic experience exists under pressure, awakes under pressure, and is projected back into the collective from which it arises. The aesthetic sense of immersion in a totality is not a claim to ownership, but owns being owned. How does this work? I think of the lines concluding the great black Chicago poet Gwendolyn Brooks's Boy Breaking Glass. You have this poem. A sloppy amalgamation, a mistake, a cliff, a hymn, a snare, and an exceeding sun. I can take this as a manifesto. This poet had earlier been prosodically mannerly, even if sharp-tongued in calling out American racism and hypocrisy. But these lines were written mid-career in 1968 at a point of personal and poetic crisis. Who were her readers? Whose approval did her poetry seek? The poem ending in these lines risks remaining a sloppy amalgamation or just a mistake. It is raw. It celebrates vandalism as right and creative, yet cannot eschew elegance in its own conduct. It starts with a brazen declaration in iambic pentameter and then stumbles into a parenthesis, working with and off a deeply embedded rhythm. It starts with a voice of authority, but fragments into multiple voices it takes some effort and doubt to assign. It infuriates me that online glosses refer to the speaker of this poem. If there's a speaker at all, there are at least 5. Boy Breaking Glass is a lyric poem, but not under the discipline of a lyric voice as ringmaster. Here's the poem. Boy Breaking Glass. Forgive the English accent for this poem. To Mark Crawford, from whom the commission. Whose broken window is a cry of art, success that winks aware as elegance, as a treasonable faith, is raw, is sonic, is old-eyed premier, our beautiful flaw and terrible ornament, our barbarous and metal little man. I shall create, if not a note, a whole, if not an overture, a desecration, full of pepper and light and salt and night and cargoes. Don't go down the plank if you see there's no extension. Each to his grief, each to his loneliness and fidgety revenge. Nobody knew where I was, and now I'm no longer there. The only sanity is a cup of tea. The music is in minors. Each one other is having different weather. It was you who threw away my name. And this is everything I have for me. Who has not Congress, lobster, love, luau, the Regency Room, the Statue of Liberty, runs? A sloppy amalgamation, a mistake, a cliff, a hymn, a snare, and an exceeding sun. Mark Crawford was a journalist who worked as foreign correspondent for the important black Chicago magazine Jet. He covered the 1965 Watts riots in a Los Angeles black ghetto for Life magazine. He implored Brooks, a prominent and respected poet, to write about the black ghetto experience. 1965, not coincidentally, marking the beginning of the black arts movement in New York. Though Chicago's black culture had a wary relationship with New York's, as a contemporary of Brooks instructed me, Chicago is a southern city in its black culture and resists metropolitan claims to primacy. The Watts riot background is significant. Brooks's poem is a compelling and stressful encounter between an impulse to celebrate an uprising, a sardonic reflection on cultural mannerliness, fear of where destruction might lead, and fear of damaging her own name. Just think of how the liberal press reacted to any attempt to justify the violence after George Floyd's death, almost 60 years later. And Brooks seems to celebrate rioting. No one could have missed that at the time. The poem ends in deciding to go wherever it might run, just as it approves the boy who has run into an action, to use George Herbert's phrase, who has been barbarous as a beast, into a snare, or somewhere that exceeds the source of light, all of these. I could perform a close reading, and there's much I love in detail, but what gives the poem its awkward power is its disjunctions, far removed from the tactical drift of much present-day American poetry. These are jolts. The poem risks falling apart, and such jolts should force us awake. The poem is not only awkward, it is untoward in its movement, yet it arrives at a great assertion, a great yes that does not self-consciously wink aware at elegance, but arises from a sonic smash of voices. This is poetry at the giddy limit. Awkwardness is what this poem shares with George Herbert's and with South Side Chicago's jazz, its rhythmic clashes and angularity. Where Herbert's awkwardness comes from the power of individual poetic expression, struggling out of doctrinal formula, Brooks's comes from the other direction, a sophisticated and subjectively attuned lyric poet whose Pulitzer Prize gilded name had been made as a reputable observer of black life, now struggling to enter into a constituency of radical black resistance. Both Herbert and Brooks are writing at the stressed hinge of their subjectivity's relationship with a collective commitment, apparent in the stresses of their poems. It is owing to stress that both Herbert and Brooks are major poets rather than representative ones. Stress motivates these poems. They are not motivated to win prizes. They are not comfortable. They are not squeamish about the lyric first person, but place it under stress. They do not claim universality, but they vouchsafe the present 21st century privileged white male's secular speaker and aesthetic experience, which has given him to think and to feel more alive. Thank you.
John, I had so many questions for you, and then you read this thing, and now I have a brand new set of questions, and I hope that's all right to switch gears. I think you set it up quite nicely. So I think my first question, and I believe you answered this I have the benefit of having John's talk here. You answered it eloquently in page 13, but in this moment in your life with all the work that you're dealing with, why did you choose stress? What in the world and what in your life made you, of the vicissitude of things, because when I reached out to you, you knew right away, as opposed to everybody else, what you wanted to discuss, and I'm very curious as to why.
I guess that I'm starting to be interested in processes of digitalization and of artificial intelligence and what those might mean socially and artistically. But I'm only just starting to think about that, so I'm particularly interested in what anybody else might have to say about that. But of course, as we are endlessly informed by computer scientists, everything is just ones and zeros. Speaking as a crazed audiophile, I keep being told that the difference between cables cannot exist because they're just sending ones and zeros. But they do differ. So I'm interested in that. I'm also interested in the reaction to it. I mentioned the return of film usage. Standing in a camera shop in Cambridge the other day, I noticed all of these undergraduates coming in buying rolls of film. I couldn't believe it. And of course, the return of vinyl has become much commented upon in Britain. But chiefly, my interest lies in a sense of ironing out. I've been puzzled by Prynne's recent poetry. I'm always puzzled by Prynne's recent poetry. Usually 6 years later, I start to get a grip on it. And it's more than likely that in 6 years' time, if I live so long, I will feel that I completely understand what he's up to in these poems. But right now, I have a sense of where this comes from because I have read his addresses on poetry where he is extremely insistent that poetry does not and should not come from any individual authorship. And when I mentioned Maoist dialectics, that was entirely serious. I was present when in Guangzhou he addressed an enormous audience in a big auditorium and berated them for having abandoned Maoism and Maoist dialectics, which was kind of an astonishing moment. But he seriously sees language as in some sense, as in a fundamental sense, as prior to its speakers. And I know that, we're all familiar with the idea that we're spoken by language, but this seems to be much more radical than that. It's a kind of completely anti-humanist position, and one which basically puts the writer in the position of being forced to abdicate from any marks of their individual expression within the poetic zone. And I just find, because I've always been especially fascinated by the workings of rhythm and complexities of rhythm in poetry, and because from the very start of my writing career, I became deeply frustrated by the predictability of rhythm in much poetry and in almost all rock music, and looked for other sources of interesting rhythm. I am puzzled that anybody should wish to or have, the motivation to write poetry which is not rhythmical. I haven't actually asked him this. I met him the other day, and he's now immobile, quite elderly and unwell. But I asked him what he was doing, and he said, "Oh, I'm writing poetry because I can't do anything else." He continues, or something continues through him. Something continues through him.
I'm really fascinated by your answer because you addressed it within sort of the lyrical boundaries and the craft and the interest of the production of poetry itself. However, in your text and your talk, there's also a historical, contemporaneous element to it. And the thing that really interests me is that I've always advocated that there is no, when form is done really well, there is no difference between form and content. So I think that's part of what you're touching on. So if I ask, I think that this is a natural question. A line that really, really struck me from what you were just reading: art offers no answer to horror. There's a really striking line, and it seems to me to be in conversation with Adorno, with the famous "there can be no poetry after," but also the 1992 retraction that, of course, everyone has a right to write poetry as much as the tortured man has a right to scream. So I'm sort of trying to understand that in that context, and in the context of, for example, the invasion of Iraq, the U.S. invasion of Iraq, another historical event that you mentioned here. Could you speak more to this?
Well, anybody who reads out of sheer boredom and in order to waste time the reviews of poetry in British mainstream journals will know that it is generally recommended for its comforting effects. I wasn't so much thinking of Adorno as I was thinking of Leo Bassani, who's written extremely eloquently against the idea of art as reparative. And I wanted to push against that too. And one of the problems about talking of aesthetic experience is that it seems to iron out every kind of response to a work of art. Either you get the aesthetic experience or you don't, and it's kind of one thing. And I wanted to somehow push back against that and to say, no, aesthetic experience is not something that gives you just this sense of wholeness, which is also, I think, often a kind of monstrous experience of egotistic expansion. But it needs to be interrogated, and it can't be seen as a substitute for political action in the real world. In other words, I don't see poetry as in itself something which is, or is only rarely and only coincidentally a political force. I can think of examples where it has been rarely and coincidentally political force. So I'm wanting to push against that, but I'm also wanting to push against the idea of poetry as being fundamentally about some kind of individual balm. And I've never read poetry as an individual balm. I've always been much more taken with the most extreme romanticist position that poetry is the most strenuous activity available to human beings as readers and writers, or can be, in the way in which it makes simultaneous intellectual and emotional demands, and that it does so within constraints, and it shows how the constraints we live and work under are fundamental to our creative activity and to our way in the world, to our language.
So, just to follow up on that answer, the act of reading poetry as well as writing it, would you say that should apply to both?
I do, but of course I don't always read in that way. I mean, one of the things about being a professional teacher is that you read in order to prepare for classes. You can also read, not necessarily poetry. I don't read poetry for sort of kicking back. I read 19th century novels for kicking back. But if I'm reading poetry, the poetry which I identify in my scanning of poetry as something unrecognized, or something that has about it a moment of the unaccountable, that is the poetry where I will stop and I will read strenuously, or at least if I have the time, I will read strenuously or put it aside.
So, and I might be straying here a little bit, but you know me and you know the things that I write about. I come from a country that has a very long civil war,
Yeah.
and I write specifically about that violence that I experienced as a young child, and I'm still examining to this day, and I think to the end of my days. A question that I get a lot is, how do you self-care after you expose yourself, that you put through yourself, through a lot of these memories and a lot of this research? I'm wondering, because I think that the opening passages of this talk really address that notion of, what did you say, corrupted version of Buddhism?
Yeah.
Is that how you phrased it? So when you are teaching, because you're mentioning this, and the practical sense of it, it is one thing to say to yourself, I will endure, and I will do, and I will put myself forth. How do you adapt that when you talk to very young writers?
I think that, well, there are several possibilities there. One possibility is to say that self-care is not about endless retreads of the same traumatic experience, which is what writers often feel is important to both their authenticity and to who they are, that they define themselves by one or two disturbing events in their lives. And the possibilities opened not just by poetry, but by any artistic practice to enter into a world which is not yours and to some extent remove yourself should not be shied away from. Those are there, and those are really important. I mean, I started, this is not comparable to your experience at all, but I started writing poetry when I was a miserable kid in a boarding school. And a boarding school of a kind of brutality which no longer, or at least not overtly, exists. It was, at that time it was meant to be good for us, but nobody would claim that now. But poetry was a way of, one of the things I want to ask Jeet later on actually is about this, because he does talk in his most recent novel as poetry as being some kind of protective carapace, and he dismisses it because of that, or at least doesn't dismiss it, but he's critical of it, of that possibility of poetry. So that's where you start off. Many writers start off in that way, that they need to write because of that. But that's not enough. What's important is that that opening engagement, or that opening necessity, has to open into a recognition of the possibility of language going into unanticipated directions and taking you to places that are not what you are familiar with or have to endure, but open up some kind of horizon of otherness and other possibility. So that, that to me is essential. You could say something about this in terms of, the therapeutic environment. In other words, the kind of therapy which proposes or purports to be able to cure trauma is very different from the kind of therapy which is long-term and expensive, but also aims to give you the possibility of living in a different way. And that's more what the psychoanalytical side is more where I think poetry is going.
Is it fair to say that, and I started with this question, why would you choose this? And you mentioned that this is something that's perplexing, and you sort of projected into the future that it would be interesting to you, and you would have more to say. However, as you're talking, it kind of seems like this has been a concern that has taken different permutations throughout. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, it's starting to emerge in my own writing, my poetic writing as a concern. In other words, a sense of digital flattening or scrim, which seems to be characteristic of much culture, in quotes, that I receive. And I wanted to explore how to resist that. It's very difficult to resist it. I mean, I'm as distractible as anybody. I not only have an iPhone, I swore I would resist an Apple Watch, but I'm wearing the damn thing,
And I suggest a watch that never works, but my nephew chose it for me, so I always use it.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the way that you're talking about things. You're obviously a scholar of the subject in addition to being a practitioner. That's, I would say, not as uncommon as some might imagine, but it's still relatively uncommon. What is the relationship for you between your sort of analytical work and your creative work? Do they feed off each other, or is this something that you have to try to actively divide?
Well, poets do tend to masquerade as scholars in the American Academy, but not only in the American Academy. I mean, much of what poets write under a scholarly guise is trying to prepare the cultural ground for the reception of their own writing, either consciously or unconsciously. So, I mean, the two things are quite closely connected, and I tend to swap between them. In other words, if I'm writing a critical piece, sometimes at its best, the experience is not that different from writing poetry. But I mean, much of what one does too is as a scholar or an academic is obviously more routine than that. But when it works, then it feels quite similar, and the concerns are the same, or much the same. They shuttle between the two forms.
Do they feed? Like, if you are doing some analysis and you are consuming this massive quantity of, does it feed into your creative work?
Yeah. I mean, I think, for instance, that the interest I developed in a poet I was taught to despise at high school, Dylan Thomas, developing that interest pretty late in life has affected some aspects of my poetic writing. Yeah.
I have a legitimate question, but I need to know why were you taught to despise Dylan Thomas?
Oh, because the high priests of close reading regarded Dylan Thomas, and I think the phrase was something like, he belongs to the history of publicity, not of poetry, was the disdainful phrase.
That's a lot of shade.
That's a lot of shade. And I think also that there was a certain kind of anti-Welsh racism involved in that.
Now that you bring up close reading, who do you write for? I had the great pleasure of perusing a lot of your work. You are prolific, and it was a very welcome challenge. But it was a journey through change. Like I really saw a voice really changing. The interest in, we mentioned consonants, that was relatively frequent, but at some point, like the whole sort of soundscape changed dramatically. So we're talking about close readers. Are you writing for close readers? Who do you imagine? Do you imagine anybody? Are you writing for yourself?
Well, it's an interesting thing because the way poetry is received can vary enormously depending on the medium of transmission. And I was very struck years ago, I mean decades ago, the language poet Ron Silliman wrote on his blog that the problem with British poets is that they have no ear. And I thought, well, Ron Silliman evidently hasn't heard, these poets read, or there's something wrong with his ear. But one of the things I have encountered is that my poetry is received by those who read it on the page as infamously difficult. I'm a kind of poster boy for difficult poetry, but that in readings I get a quite different response because there is a sort of direct emotional connection which sometimes arises with an audience. And I mean, one of the nicest things, recent things that anybody has said was after I published a poem in Poetry magazine, I doubt that'll happen again, somebody wrote to say that they didn't understand a word of it, but it was the only poem they liked in the issue. And this was somebody I didn't know. So I was really pleased. I thought that's exactly the kind of response that, because that's what I want in a poem. I want to read a poem and say, what the hell is going on here? This is something new to me, and I've got to find a way of negotiating it. And I don't want to, just read what I recognize after I've read a few lines. I've read too much poetry. So it's like when, my son, as a teenager, would excitedly announce he'd discovered some band, and I would listen to it, and I'd say, oh, well, that sounds just like so-and-so. I realized after a while that this was unkind. But I feel like that with too much. I mean, that can be enriching as well. I mean, I think, for example, of visual art and how much richer my experience of visual art is now that I've seen so much and immediately can summon up, a kind of set of conventions and an archive of work that I've seen previously.
I thought a lot recently, I think a lot about James Baldwin in general, but I thought about that quote while I was reading your work. You think you are alone in the world. I'm misquoting, I'm paraphrasing here. But I think you think you are alone in the world, but then you read books, essentially. And that is, I think, for the most part, why we write. And what made me really think about that was what makes you feel alone in the world. It is not the book that, somebody else has fallen in love. That is common. That is not the thing that makes us feel in love. But the incomprehensible is that which makes us fall in love. So it is important to read. Perhaps this sounds unkind, like this band sounds just like, but also inscrutable poetry, poetry that demands of us, because that demand is the essence of what it takes to make community.
Well, that's right, and it can reproduce for us as readers something of the experience of writers, where there's a kind of semantic emergence as you work within the material of language. I mean, rather than any literary criticism, what makes most sense to me in describing my creative process and the way in which I respond is abstract expressionist painting. I'm an abstract expressionist poet, and when I read how de Kooning or Joan Mitchell worked, when I look at their painting, I think, yes, that's exactly the way in which I work with language. And I start with something which is a kind of colour field or whatever, and gradually as I work within it, what I'm aiming for is a sense of the just tangible emergence of a form and of a semantic centre or a set of semantic centres, a kind of metastatic coherence to the poem, just as I see in in a canvas by Joan Mitchell, for example?
We're coming up on time, so I don't get to ask more questions on that. But I know your email. So here's my question. I mentioned earlier, a lot of people ask me, like, how do I what's my self-care routine? Which I don't have one. But it's also the question I hate the most and consistently get most frequently. My favorite question is the one I'm going to ask now, which is there a question that you wish people would ask about your work that never gets asked?
I think actually I just answered the question which I have never been asked and would have liked to have been asked. So this is it. For the first time, I'm outing myself as an abstract expressionist poet.
That's wonderful and excellent, because this opens up time. If there are any questions in the audience, I would love to hear it. And I see one now. Go ahead, Chiku.
Thanks, John. That was great. Oh, no, that's okay. I'm fine. Here. I have so many questions, but that's why we get to hang out afterwards. But maybe just a simple question that maybe gets at you were saying you're kind of interested now in the kind of flattening out of stress and affect that kind of a digital and machine language kind of that the effects that produces. And so I was kind of thinking of that as a kind of flattening out of stress that occurs in a kind of post-human kind of context, right? Yeah. Post-human speech, ChatGPT or whatever it may be. And then thinking about how that kind of matches up and squares with Prin's, or your reading of Prin's recent work, or his politics of kind of like anti-humanist, maybe not post-human, but anti-humanist kind of way of thinking about the poem as a field of that's evacuated of the kind of fingerprint of personality or identity, individual identity. But the main prosodic difference between Prin's version of a non-human kind of speech and a digital machine speech is that Prin's poems here in the packet are nothing but stress, right? And so I'm just curious to hear you think a little bit, or to say a little bit about that. Like, maybe is that part of Prin's response to kind of contemporaneity, that there's either a post-human speech, digital machine speech that is evacuated of stress, or a kind of utopian, anti-humanist speech that is all stress, right? Or is that kind of overly simplifying the?
I think that's a very interesting idea. I did comment at one point that all stress and no stress end up being much the same, because both of them are evacuated of individual human agency and difference, yeah. But I suspect that you're right, that there is something utopian about it. A striking feature of his early poetic sequences is that they tend to leap into some kind of utopian overdrive in the final moment of the sequence, having before then put the reader through all kinds of confrontation with horrors, whether it's the poisoning of the earth or the war in Iraq or whatever it might be. So it might be thinking of the overall trajectory, and if one were to think of these recent poems as examples of an endlessly reiterated coming to a conclusion, then maybe there's something in that, and I could look at them again with that in mind. I mean, as I said in my response to Lena, I'm very conscious that I'm talking about these poems prematurely, but there's been a lot of chatter about them amongst poets in Britain. And so far, puzzlement is the overwhelming response from really pretty sophisticated readers whom I would tend to expect to offer guidance. But the idea that they're all stress is, I mean, in reading them aloud, it's impossible to avoid, to some extent, converting them into stress. That's one reason why Prynne never read his poetry aloud. I mean, he never wanted to be identified with his poems. He only read them aloud in China. Yeah. He refused all offers to read them aloud in the UK, and it was only in China that he would read them. I mean, there are other writers whose work eschews lyric stress patterns because they have an entirely different sense of rhythm. I mean, I think of a writer like Barbara Guest, who explicitly was interested in 12-tone music. So she was interested in the way in which cells can repeat across the extent of a work, but would never go into anything so romantic as a cadence, But nonetheless, that is something that is recognizable as producing stress effects across. You just have to be alert to the way in which rhythm can operate across a text of 30 pages and bounce echoes across that duration, which is kind of demanding on a reader, but it's possible. Whereas with the Prynne, the sense of getting some feel for the overall curve of one of these texts, I haven't got there yet. I described it as circuit board-like, and that's still how it reads to me. I mean, I'm quite sure that somebody like, one of our friends like Joshua Cotin or somebody is going to come up with a brilliant reading of one of these poems and completely discountenance me.
Thank you so much, John, truly.
Thank you, Lee.